Good evening, everyone, and welcome to American Center in Moscow's program, From Golden Age to Graphic Medicine, A Brief Comics History. My name is Dr. Ryan Montoya, and today I have the pleasure of speaking to you about two of my favorite topics, comic books and me. I appreciate you joining tonight's event, and I'm going to be discussing comic book history and also the field of graphic medicine. So I'd like to invite our viewers at home to think about any questions you might have about the presentation, because at the end of the program, we'll have time to answer those, as well as some other questions that have been previously submitted online. So with that, let's start our discussion. Okay, so again, our presentation is From Golden Age to Graphic Medicine, A Brief Comics History. So when I was thinking about this talk, I was trying to figure out what we could possibly discuss or cover in 45 minutes. So what we're going to do is first talk about my background as a medical doctor and a comic book artist. Then we're going to explore the evolution of comic books, from proto-comics to superhero titles to independent stories. And then finally, we're going to examine the genre of graphic medicine and see where it fits into the history of independent comics. So first, let's briefly go over my background. In terms of my medical career, I completed my undergraduate degree at Harvard University, and then I completed my medical training and my residency training in primary care at the University of Massachusetts Medical School. I've also had other healthcare experiences, like I practiced prison health at the Federal Corrections Institution at Devambez, Massachusetts. I've practiced direct primary care. I've acted as the medical director and as the director of primary care at Planned Parenthood in Washington, D.C. And currently I work as a physician medical officer at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow for the U.S. Department of State. And while here, I also get a chance to liaise with the medical team at NASA for their Moscow-based mission. So that's my medical career. Here's some pictures, some visual aids. This picture on the left, you can see me with my wife in Red Square in front of St. Basil's Cathedral. In the middle, you can see on the top and the bottom, this is some of the work I did for primary care and reproductive health care at the Planned Parenthood clinic in Washington, D.C. In the top right, you can see a cute patient I had in Bangalore, India. My wife and I lived in India for 2 years, and I was able to practice community medicine in Bangalore. The bottom right, this is not a patient. This is my daughter who's using my stethoscope. And you can tell that she is my daughter because we both have the same massive forehead. All right. Another aspect of my career is that I am a luggage and trunk designer for the luxury brand Goyard that's based in France. And what I do is I design luggages for clients who are looking for something specifically that they want made for them. So the first project I ever did with this company is an artist trunk. This was made in 2013. And the idea with this trunk is this was supposed to be a traveling art studio. So it's a trunk you would carry around, you open it up, and inside you would have a drawing table that folds up. You also have a drawer for all your art materials, and you also have a spot to hold your art portfolio. So this is something I still am able to do and have the pleasure of doing part-time. Finally, and most importantly, and most relevant to this discussion, I am an illustrator and a comic book artist and have been doing this for over 20 years at this point. This is a selection of some of my work. For any of you cartoon fans out there, you might recognize this character. This is Booba. For any of you who don't, Booba is this weird alien hobgoblin who just has all these misadventures with a bunch of his friends. It happens to be a very popular Russian cartoon and my daughter's favorite cartoon. So I drew this for my daughter for her birthday. These two images that you see, the next two images on the right, are selections from my graphic novel, Precipitated Withdrawal, and we'll talk about that a little bit more at the end of the presentation. This middle image is an image that I drew to accompany an essay I wrote about the Tuskegee syphilis experiment in the United States. And this image on the right is a drawing of Edward Scissorhands. This is one of my wife's favorite movies. And I drew this illustration when I was proposing to her. She said yes, so it all worked out. So those are samples of some of my work, and that's briefly my background. So most importantly, I am a doctor and a comic book artist, and my goal now is to start talking about the evolution of comics, okay? And I will preface this part by saying this has a specific focus. I'm mostly focusing on American comics, but there are some exceptions. I'm most of the time focusing on mainstream comics, and there are some exceptions. And I try and pick really important examples, kind of shining examples of each era, but there's only so much we can cover in these 45 minutes. So let's start at the beginning. The origins of comics are sometimes called proto-comics. We take a look at proto-comics or early strips. And there's a controversy about when comics, as they exist today, first started. Some people argue that it started all the way back in the Mesoamerican time or in the Aztec time, because you can see tapestries, you can see sculptures with sequences and illustrations that are placed in order and meant to be read in order. Some people think that those are the earliest types of comics. Other people, and a large proportion of people, believe that the modern comics have its origin in William Hogarth's 18th century sequential art. So this was a early British cartoonist. He had done a number of political cartoons, sort of masterful illustrations, but he had a whole series of sequential art plates. And if you take a look at this selection on the left, you can see these beautiful engravings. They're really, really detailed illustrations, but most importantly, they are sequences of illustrations that are meant to be read in order and all taken together. And that's what distinguishes it from political cartoons, what distinguishes it from regular illustrations. And so many people consider these sequences of illustrations with words underneath the first comics. Now, if we fast forward from the 1700s to late 1800s, we can see some of the pioneering newspaper strips. And one of the titles I wanted to highlight is The Yellow Kid. This is one of the first serially produced or serially reproduced newspaper comic strips. And you can see the Yellow Kid here is the main character in a sequence of 6 comic panels, and it's considered some of the earliest comics that were serialized. You can also see some of the hallmarks of modern comics. So you can see motion lines, you can see kind of dynamic movement, but not all the hallmarks are there. So you don't see classic word balloons or dialogue balloons. Instead, on the Yellow Kid, there's this weird convention where the Yellow Kid never says anything, but anything he's saying or thinking is written on the front or the back of his shirt. It's really strange. I don't think any other cartoon or comic has ever done this, but yeah, it's a little off-putting, but you can see they're trying to figure out the language and the semantics of modern comic telling. So those are the origins. But then we move on to the Golden Age. Now, most people consider the Golden Age of comics the years between 1938 and 1956. And so I highlighted 3 seminal titles from the Golden Age. They are Action Comics #1, which is the first appearance of Superman, which came out in 1938. There's Detective Comics #27 in 1939, which features the first appearance of Batman. There's Captain America #1, the first appearance of Captain America in 1941. Now, what's fascinating is these are all three Golden Age superheroes, and all of them are some of the most enduring popular characters we still see today. And they were all invented and created within 3 years of each other, which is really fascinating. These comics tell simple stories, and each of these characters are archetypes. They're monoliths. They represent very big, frankly, very simple ideas. So you take a look at Action Comics #1. Action Comics #1 is the story of Superman. Superman is an alien baby. His planet of Krypton is about to explode. His parents send him on a spaceship. It lands in the middle of a Kansas wheat field. He's raised by 2 American farmers, and he becomes Superman after he discovers his superpowers. Now, on the surface, this represents a lot of strongman stories that have existed before and existed around that time in 1938. But what's interesting is if you think about the authors, Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, 2 Jews living in Ohio at the time, and you think about their story and you think about their parents' story, this can very easily be seen as an allegory for the Jewish American immigrant experience. Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster's parents fled Europe years before Superman was created, and they were looking to come to America for a better life, better opportunity. The parallels between that and Superman's journey are often cited, and even cited by Shuster and Siegel themselves. You also think about this time period between 1938 and 1956 in the United States, and there's a great deal of poverty, a great deal of social unrest because of a lack of financial security in a lot of households in the United States. And you think about a story like the invention of Batman and how much that would resonate with its audiences. So at this time in the United States, there might not have been a lot of police protection for a lot of poorer people or immigrants in the country. And to hear or read a story about a vigilante who takes laws into matters of law into his own hands and is able to fight crime is a story that's really, really powerful and really compelling to its audiences at the time. Batman was almost instantly a massive sales success for that reason. And then you get to something like Captain America. All right, so Captain America is a story about Steve Rogers, this scrawny kid who enlists in the war, gets injected with a serum, becomes this super soldier who's strong enough to punch Hitler in the face and basically single-handedly defeat all the Nazis in World War II. I mean, this is the essence of kind of wartime propaganda. It's pure patriotism in the form of comics. What's interesting is, you know, he's endured as a symbol in different ways, but he really started out as something to kind of bolster the wartime effort in the United States. So we move on from the Golden Age to the Silver Age. Silver Age spans from 1956 to 1970. And this era is seen as a real revival of the superhero genre and changes the whole slate and the whole tenor of what superheroes represented. So I highlighted 3 titles here. Starting on the left, you have Fantastic Four #1 in 1961, which introduces the Fantastic Four. You have Amazing Fantasy #15 in 1962, which introduces Spider-Man. And you have X-Men #1 in 1963, which obviously introduces the X-Men. Now, what's interesting about these slate of heroes is they all represent superheroes that have much more complex characteristics and ideas than the heroes in the Golden Age. So while the heroes in the Golden Age, again, were archetypes, were almost monolithic, here you had superheroes with some internal struggles. So for instance, if you look at the Fantastic Four, this is a group of 4 family members or scientists who go into outer space and they come back and they have superpowers. One of them is the Thing, and it's this rock-like creature with super strength, but who hates his superpowers. And you know, that might not seem so complex nowadays, but at that time it was pretty revelatory to have superheroes who didn't like their superpowers and didn't like their personal appearance. And it was a real watershed moment for superhero development. The other thing to think about is what is going on during this period from 1956 to 1970. There's a great deal of apprehension and nervousness in the United States about nuclear war, nuclear radiation. This is a new concern in the American public consciousness, and it's reflected in these stories. So take a look at Fantastic Four. I was just talking about this right now. This is a story about 4 scientists who go into outer space. They get exposed to nuclear radiation. They come back and they all have superpowers. You look at Spider-Man. This is mild-mannered teenager Peter Parker who gets bitten by a radioactive spider and gains the proportionate strength and power of a spider. You look at the Hulk, who's not pictured here. He's a scientist who gets exposed to gamma rays and becomes the Hulk and gains superpower. These can all be seen as direct reflections and also confusions about what nuclear power does, what nuclear power is capable of, and also the anxieties about it in general during this period in the United States from 1956 to 1970. And the last thing that this era is known for, that the Silver Age is known for, is how it starts to chip away at some social issues in the United States and in the American consciousness. So I featured X-Men here because X-Men did not gain their superpowers through nuclear radiation. Their superpowers came from mutations in their genes and their chromosomes, and so they were born with these superpowers. What's interesting is the creators, Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, made no efforts to hide the fact that the X-Men were supposed to be an allegory for the civil rights movement. Stan Lee goes out and says it in multiple interviews. And the idea is the X-Men were supposed to be stand-ins for Black or brown people in the United States who were being discriminated against. So in these early X-Men issues, you can read it, and they're fighting supervillains, but they're also being mocked by the public. They're having fire hoses sprayed on them. They're having things thrown at them. And this is the context in which Stan Lee and Jack Kirby created these stories. So again, this is a completely different focus and a completely different drive to these heroes in the Silver Age compared to the Golden Age. We move on to the Bronze Age, which is considered the years 1970 to 1985. And what's interesting is this is sort of a transition period between Silver Age and the Modern Age. And because of that, there's a lot of anxiety and uncertainty in these comics, and it's why it makes it one of the most compelling eras for me. So I highlighted 3 titles here. Miracle Man #1 in 1982, Iron Man #128 in 1979, and Green Lantern, Green Arrow #85 in 1971. So what this era is known for, what the Bronze Age is known for, is a real examination of personal struggles. Okay, in particular, for whatever reason, there was just this whole slate of superhero comics that dealt with substance abuse. So you can see here, Iron Man is dealing with alcoholism. You can see here, Green Lantern and Green Arrow's Ward is dealing with heroin addiction. These were really, really big, very, very controversial ideas to be put in popular media that would be reaching kids. And so the Bronze Age is seen as the first era in popular mainstream comics to deal with these sorts of things. The other thing about a lot of comics in this era is it's starting to deal with identities of war and post-war in the United States, in particular, the relationship to the Vietnam War. And so you can see in some of these storylines the reflection of sort of an alienation, a detachment that's reflected in some of the superheroes that you never saw in the Silver Age and you never saw in the Golden Age. And I highlight this title, Miracle Man, in particular, because it's a really, really fascinating story. So Miracle Man was a bit of a throwaway hero from the late 1930s. And those stories were really simple and frankly, kind of juvenile. So The idea was Miracle Man was a superhero who would face some sort of situation, some sort of supervillain, and he performed these miracles, and everything would be solved very quickly and very simply. What the writer Alan Moore did with this rebirth of Miracle Man was he took this same character who had these same silly powers, and he brought him back to the year 1982, and the world had moved on. So this is the same superhero. He still had the same powers, but they meant nothing because these miracles did not apply in the modern age. And so this story, this whole story arc, is just examining what it would be like for a superhero to be purposeless and wandering around on Earth. This is a really, really interesting idea, and many people cite the kind of American popular psyche at the time as the reason for these stories being told. So after the Bronze Age, we get to the modern age, which is defined as any comics made from 1985 to present. Now, some people believe that there's another stage, or another age rather, that starts at the year 2000 to present, but generally speaking, we consider 1985 to now is modern age popular comics. I highlighted 3 modern age comics that I think are probably 3 of the most important comics ever made. They are, excuse me, Watchmen #1 in 1986, The Dark Knight Returns #1 in 1986, and Sandman #1 in 1988. Now, again, these are 3 of the most seminal titles ever made in the world of comics. The idea that they were made within 2 years of each other is really remarkable to me as someone who loves comics history. Now, these titles are really important because they represent a real great diversity, a diversity in theme, a diversity in subject matter, really, really dark subject matter in some cases. And it focuses on heroes that are completely fallible and sort of a hyper reality in some cases. So when you take a look at this comic on the left, Watchmen is another story by Alan Moore. And what it does is it takes the idea of the superhero and places it in the real world. So Alan Moore wrote this story about 12 superheroes who were previously active. And it imagines a world where what would happen if these superheroes were actually placed in real life? What would the government's relationship with these superheroes be? Would they try and regulate the superheroes? Would they try and sanction them? What would the relationship be like among the superheroes? Would they get along? Would they hate each other? Were they fallible? Did they have personal problems that actually made them villains, not superheroes? And finally, what would happen if one of these superheroes were murdered? Would they all band together? Would they turn on each other? And what sort of skeletons would be dug up from the past? It is an enormously influential comic. It's also been made into a movie and TV shows, but its echoes are still felt today in modern superhero comics. Every type of creator has always tried to approach the level of sophistication that this comic reached. This middle comic that I highlighted, The Dark Knight Returns, is another really important superhero comic, another important mainstream title. This is a comic about Batman, and it imagines an alternate universe Batman who is retired. He's old, he's been retired for 10 years, but he sees Gotham City is fallen into decay, and so he comes out of retirement. And what the story is about an aging superhero who has to go to more extreme, more desperate lengths to fight criminals, and the line between him being a superhero and a villain becomes more and more blurred, just depending on the extreme lengths that he approaches. Sandman is another interesting title. This is by Neil Gaiman, and this came out in 1988. And this was a character that was originally a comic in the late 1920s. And what it dealt with was a superhero who could read people's dreams. But what Neil Gaiman did was he took this character and he made him a master of dreams, someone who was able to go in and out of other people's dreams and occupy this dream space. And really, it's a chance for Neil Gaiman to explore his fascination with myths, with traditional storytelling, and turning it on its head. So it's really one of the most well-regarded comic books ever made. It's still technically a superhero comic, but it was able to introduce a lot of mature themes that no other era before it was ever able to accomplish. So this is not a specific comics era, but I did want to talk about the 90s art revolution. So in the early 1990s, there was a real sea change in terms of artistic style, where the style really changed and you'd have much more dynamic anatomy, you'd have much more explosive layouts, and it was spearheaded by a number of artists, but two in particular were kind of the head of the pack. There were Todd McFarlane, who was drawing Spider-Man, and Jim Lee, who was drawing X-Men. What's interesting about this era is that it heralded the idea of the artist as a known entity. So if you followed comics in the 1970s and the 1980s, you might know some artists, but by the time the 1990s rolled around and you saw the work of Jim Lee, Todd McFarlane, Rob Liefeld, Mark Silvestri, Whilce Portacio, Eric Larson, you knew who these people were, and they were their own celebrities in the comic world. So what happened is a number of these very popular individual artists who were working for big titles like Marvel and DC knew that they were frustrated with working with these companies because any of the art that they produced, they didn't own. They didn't own any of the stories that they worked on. They didn't own any of the characters. They couldn't license any of this material. So they all left these big companies, formed their own company or series of companies, and this era of creator-owned titles was born. The idea was they go out on their own, make their own superheroes, and they owned everything. They owned the art, they owned the story, they owned the licensing. They could merchandise it and make it into toys. They could make movies. And that era continues today. There's a big push still towards creator-owned titles, even if people will still always be attracted to some of the legacy titles like Spider-Man and X-Men. So we've been talking about American comics this entire time, but we need to talk about Japanese comics. We need to talk about manga, and we need to talk about the country that's frankly probably contributed more to the history of comics than any other country in the world. So the breadth of titles and the types of comics made in Japan is too broad to cover in this presentation, but I did want to focus on two landmark serialized manga titles that are responsible for popularizing manga across the world. And those are Akira in 1982 by Katsuhiro Otomo and Ghost in the Shell in 1989 by Masamune Shirow. So these two titles, as well as a lot of titles in the late 80s to early 90s, dealt with post-nuclear power structure. They dealt with societal critique. They dealt with digital consciousness. And these themes pervaded a lot of Japanese comics. I did want to highlight these two titles because they're so important and so influential, not just to Japanese comics, but to popular culture around the world. So Akira is a story about Tokyo in the year 1982, where a nuclear bomb explodes and World War III ensues. And then decades later, in the rebuilt city of Neo-Tokyo, they discover that this nuclear bomb was not a nuclear bomb, but a small child with telekinetic powers named Akira. And upon this discovery, the story follows what a country, what the world will do if they find out that this sort of power exists. How will they try and control it? What sort of governmental structures will try and rein it in? What sorts of personal interests will be involved in trying to worship this child? And so over the course of 2,500 or 2,800 pages, it follows every single consequence of the idea of this power existing in this child and a number of other individuals around this child. The story of Ghost in the Shell is really interesting. So this is a manga, again, that was started by Masamune Shirow in 1989, and it follows the story of Major Kusanagi. This is a special police operative. She's a cybernetic organism, or a cyborg. So she's part human, part robot. As the story goes along, the percentage of what's human and what's robot just depends on what kind of modification she makes. But her main goal is to track down this computer virus that's running rampant throughout the city, who's called the Ghost. Okay, and it seems like a simple mission at first, but each time that she interacts with this virus called the Ghost starts asking her more and more difficult questions. In particular, the Ghost asks, why, as a computer virus, is the Ghost not a soul? Okay, it has all the characteristics. It can think, it can feel. And also, what defines digital consciousness versus human consciousness or a soul? And this is the ultimate theme that Ghost in the Shell grapples with, and it's a theme that reverberates in a lot of other manga and popular culture even today. So we talked about superhero comics, which are mainstream comics. We talked a little bit about Japanese comics. Now we're going to talk about independent comics. So if you are talking about the American comic landscape, if you say independent comics, essentially what you're saying are non-superhero comics or underground comics that are considered autobiographical or literary. And what I did with this slide is I made a mosaic of what I think are some of the most important independent comics ever made. So if you can see this, I don't know if you'll ever have access to these slides, but I recommend, if you can, to maybe take a picture of this, take a screenshot of it. If you have not read these titles and you are interested in comics, I strongly recommend you read every single one of these. And I wanted to go over briefly some of them. So there's Mouse by Art Spiegelman. I'm going to talk about that in the next slide, so we'll hold off on that. There's Ghost World by Daniel Clowes. So Ghost World is this fantastic comic from the early 90s, and it kind of focuses on the ennui and the boredom of growing up in suburban America. There's A Contract with God by Will Eisner. Will Eisner is considered the sort of originator, the godfather of sequential art. And with this long-form comic called A Contract with God, he created the genre of the graphic novel. It's the first long-form, non-serialized comic ever made with one story. And he invented this whole genre with this comic book. There's Bone by Jeff Smith, which is a really cute, fantastic story of three cartoon brothers who get stuck in a magical forest and have to find their way out, whether through friendship or through adventures. There's Concrete by Paul Chadwick. This is a really fascinating story, fascinating comic, and it's about an alien that has been put into a body that's made of concrete and just dropped on Earth. And the entire story revolves around how this big, heavy concrete being would interact with real life. So where would he live? Whom would he scare, and who would he become friends with? What kind of bed would he sleep in? How would he be transported around? Like, what kind of car or bus could carry him around? Would he form human relationships? Would he form romantic relationships? And ultimately, at the end of the series, you kind of get the sense that this is a modern day Frankenstein's monster, and it's examining what it means to be human. I also highlight Stuck Rubber Baby by Howard Cruz. This is what I consider the greatest graphic novel ever made. It's a story about, it's a thinly veiled autobiography about the author growing up in racially segregated Dixie South in the United States in the 60s, and how he tries to join the civil rights movement. This title, Cerebus by Dave Sim, is a really fun, really kind of tragic long-form comic about Cerebus, who's an aardvark. And the author, Dave Sim, wanted to create a story from the beginning of life all the way to the end. And so he created this aardvark. The first issue starts with the aardvark being born, and he lives for thousands of years, and he becomes a pope, he becomes a hockey player, he becomes a barbarian, he opens up a bar, and it just follows his life all the way to the end. And the last issue is when he dies, and it's just a complete life told from beginning to end. It's really, really fascinating. This other title I highlighted, Martha Washington Goes to War, is this really, really interesting comic by Frank Miller. It takes place in a alternate post-Reagan era, and it features the main character, Martha Washington, who grows up in the Cabrini Green projects. But the United States is kind of, all the government has been taken over by corporate interests. And it shows how Martha Washington, who's been trained to deal with wars, how she tries to navigate this new political landscape. I mentioned that most of the comics we're talking about are American, but I did want to highlight Arzac by Moebius, or the French comics artist Jean Girard. Arzac is a series of short stories that originally appeared in Heavy Metal magazine, and it is really one of the most fantastic, strange, unsettling science fiction stories ever made. It's almost completely wordless. It follows this nomadic character as he rides around on this flying horse and just goes over this weird barren landscape, and it examines solitude, quietness. It's really, really some of the best science fiction comics ever made. Milk and Cheese by Evan Dorkin is a really fantastic independent comic that came out in the early 90s. It's about milk and cheese. It's about this little milk carton named Milk, this huge chunk of cheese named Cheese, and they're just two of the most foul-mouthed, like grotesque, angry, violent little figures, and it's just following them, wreaking havoc on anything or anyone they come across. It's kind of prototypical early Gen X skater culture, counterculture comics, and it's a really, really fun read. And finally, I mentioned Robert Crumb comics. We're going to talk about that in a second, but Robert Crumb is considered sort of the pioneer of the underground comic scene in the 1960s, and we'll talk about some of those comics on the next slide. Okay, so I mentioned independent comics. Their themes clearly are much more varied than superhero comics. They talk about identity and history and personal struggle and satire. Superhero comics still to this day dominates the market, but independent comics are often credited for expanding comics' artistic and narrative potential. And so again, we have selections from some of those comics I mentioned before. There's Mouse by Art Spiegelman, which is like a Pulitzer Prize winning comic about the author's parents who survived the Holocaust. There are Robert Crumb comics, and there's Stuck Rubber Baby, which I mentioned before, really fantastically, deeply felt story about growing up in the South in the 60s. Okay, so we've talked about independent comics, but what is graphic medicine, this genre I mentioned earlier? Graphic medicine simply is a subset of independent comics. If you look up the definition, it's called a field of study, a community of practice, and genre defined as the intersection of the medium of comics and the discourse of healthcare. That's really just a fancy way of saying it's comics that have to do with medicine. So graphic medicine focuses on healthcare experience in different ways. It can address health and medical narratives in different ways, but can also be used as sort of an educational tool or just a tool for personal expression. The genre can include a lot of different themes, but it usually includes patient experiences. It can include healthcare professionals' perspectives. And when it's doing its job well, it can sometimes destigmatize medical issues and also promote empathy. I highlighted two kind of prominent graphic medicine titles. This is Cancer Vixen by Marissa Marchetto, where she describes how she tried to approach her breast cancer diagnosis like a superhero attacking a villain. And then there's Epileptic by David B. This is a French comics artist who talks about what it's like growing up with his brother who had epileptic seizures. So the comic book I am working on is called Precipitated Withdrawal, and this is a graphic medicine comic. This is a comic that would fit into that category. It focuses on the field of opioid addiction in the United States, and it talks about how the field of primary care medicine is uniquely poised to address the addiction. So what I've done is I've divided the story into 12 discrete chapters, and my goal with each chapter is to sort of pull the curtain back on a specific topic in primary care that most people wouldn't know about. So whether it's talking about prison health or what it takes to pronounce someone dead, the book is supposed to give a view on American healthcare from a perspective of a primary care doctor. So here are some sample pages from the comic. This page on the left is a story about how basically the poorer you are in the United States, the less time you have with your doctor. This middle page is about my experiences in prison health. This page on the right is a story about informed consent, and my argument is that doctors, myself included sometimes, are so bad at explaining what's going on with the patient to the patient that they can never truly provide informed consent to their provider. So with this last part of the presentation, we're heading towards the end. I thought it'd be fun to talk about what it takes to lay out and produce a page from my comic. So when I start a comic page, I know I have to do two things. I have to write a certain amount of material. I have to complete a certain amount of art. And I have to accomplish that within the confines of a page. So in this page, what I need to do is I need to show an elderly patient who undergoes cardiac arrest. I need to show a series of healthcare providers who are performing chest compressions on the patient to try and restart his heart. Also in the room, I need to show the patient's wife, who is horrified at how violent these chest compressions are. And she tells the healthcare team to stop performing chest compressions because she believes it's hurting her husband. And then at the end of this page, I need to show that she needs to make a decision about whether or not the healthcare team should continue these chest compressions or if they should stop and they should let the patient die. So I need to accomplish that on this page. This page is not good looking at all for a few reasons. First of all, it's a sketch, so it doesn't need to look pretty. But in terms of layout, it's a mess. Okay, you can see here there are a number of panels that are the exact same size. So panel 1, panel 3, 4, 5, and 6 are all the same size. Now, when you're laying out a page, that's a problem because the eye is trained to look for things that are equal size. So when you're reading this, instead of going from left to right, you actually might sometimes go up to down because this is the exact same size, or you might go from up to down again. So visually, this is not laid out well at all. The other thing is there's so many panels here and so many words that it interrupts the flow of the story and it's very, very confusing. So I knew that I had to change the layout of this page completely. And here's how I did it. Now, one of the goals I wanted to accomplish here is I wanted people to walk away with the idea that there were two major visual elements of the page. The first is I wanted to show a huge set of hands that are performing chest compressions because I wanted people to feel the impact of how hard a chest compression is. The other is I wanted to focus on the patient's wife and the very difficult, almost impossible decision she has to make about whether or not her husband should continue receiving chest compressions. So I relayed it out so that these two visual elements are the most important. The other thing is I wanted to apply what's called the golden ratio. A lot of you people listening have probably heard of this. It's a mathematical ratio, 1.6 to 1. And the idea is you take an object or space and you divide it into bisecting rectangles over and over again, and you join the corners and you create a ratio that's very visually pleasing. It's something that you see in art and architecture, and you even see it in nature in things like seashells. So what I wanted to do is apply the golden ratio and make sure the visual elements match the golden ratio. So I used the golden ratio as a guide for this page. And what I did was I divided the page into a top 2/3, a bottom 1/3. And then this visually divided the first part of the page from the bottom part of the page. And then if you follow along the scroll of the golden ratio, you can see that the scroll divides these big set of hands from the patient's wife. If you follow along, it ends up at the patient's wife's eyes. And that's what I wanted to be the final image that people thought of when they read this page. So this is what the layout looked like. And here's what the final page looked like. Again, exact same layout, but you have the top 2/3, the bottom third. You see the huge hands, and you see the patient's wife as the two major visual elements. Now, the golden ratio doesn't have to only apply to the whole page. You can also apply to individual panels. So I tried to do the same thing with the individual panels at the top. And I applied the golden ratio. I wanted to divide the hands from the patient's wife. And I want you to follow along the golden ratio, and you end up right at the look of terror on the patient's wife's eyes. So again, the final page and the golden ratio. So we've talked about the evolution of superhero comics, and you can see that when we trace the history of American superhero comics, we're lending insight into sort of the political and societal sentiments at that time. We've also taken a look at independent comics and how they diverge from the mainstream superhero comics in theme, in art, in scope, and purpose, and they really allow for an enormous expansion of creativity. We've also seen how graphic medicine continues the tradition of independent comics by sort of mining the depths of the healthcare experience. So, you know, when you are examining the historical context of a comic and its categorization, you're contributing to the scholarship of this still relatively young art form. So the next time you are reading a comic, a great comic, I want you to consider the evolution of the comic genre that led to its creation, and also think about where comics might go in the future. So that is my presentation. I want to thank you for listening. And I know already that we have some questions on the side, so I'm going to go into those right away. Okay. The first question is from Andre. How many years did you study? Okay, so for Andre, it depends on when we start counting. If we start after high school, I did 4 years of my undergraduate degree. I did 4 years of medical school, and I did 3 years of residency. And so that's 11 years from the end of high school to finish my training as a physician. I have a question from Yoka. She says, thank you for your inspiring talk. For someone who isn't knowledgeable about comic books as a genre, what strategy would you recommend to get acquainted with it better? Should you start chronologically from the Golden Age to the Silver Age and so on, or would you suggest a different approach? Okay, this is a great question. What I try and tell people is, this is not a homework assignment. I mean, if you like, you could start from the beginning, but frankly, I actually don't think the early Superman or Batman comics will resonate with most readers. I actually tell people to think about something that you are interested in, and then find, like any other topic that you're interested in, and then try and find a title that closely matches that. So, I mean, let's say you're interested in food. You can look up a comic series called Oin Shinbo, O-I-N S-H-I-B-O. It's a Japanese comic, and it's a whole series devoted to people who are starting restaurants. Or if you like fantasy, you can go that route. And I invite people to read what they like, whether it's comic books or books in general. And then if you notice something that might be a connection to another series, or you hear that it was inspired by another series, that's what you pursue. And that's the way you build your personal history. We have another question saying, good evening, Ryan. Which superhero was your favorite one in your childhood, and which one is now that you're an adult doctor? Okay, so my favorite superhero in general was Spider-Man. And what was interesting is Spider-Man started out as a pure superhero story, and then there was a transition where it became basically a romance comic, because it was being drawn by this artist, John Romita, who's a romance artist. And what I find interesting is when I read those issues, which were already back issues at the time, I read about him fighting the Green Goblin or the Vulture or whatever, and I really wasn't that interested in the action scenes. I really, really liked the personal drama in Peter Parker's life. I liked that he struggled being parented by Aunt May. I liked that he was in the middle of a love triangle with two women. I liked that he was being bullied at school. Those were really compelling to me, and it's not a mystery. It's because I was a high school student at the time. And so I think what makes Spider-Man still resonate today is because he's one of the more vulnerable, fallible heroes, and it's one of the reasons why I like him the most. As far as who is my favorite superhero now, I don't really follow superhero comics quite as much now. I still follow Spider-Man a little bit. I still follow X-Men a little bit. But most of my greatest memories are not of the superheroes, but of the artists who were working on it at the time. I was fascinated with how these stories were drawn and the styles that were used to draw them, much more than the characters themselves. Another question is, what was my first comic? I don't know if this means my first one that I drew or the first one I read. The first one I ever read, it was Ninja Turtles. Eastman and Laird's Ninja Turtles. And for any of you people who don't know, you might know the cartoon and you might know the movie. The original comic by Eastman and Laird is so different. It's so dark. It is so violent. But my mom and my grandparents used to rent these large collection of comic books of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles from the library. And my brothers and I would devour it. That was my first real comic that I'd read. And the other kind of comic I was reading at the time was The Punisher, another really dark story. But I was fascinated with the art form and fascinated with how the stories were told, and then kind of grew my fascination from there. I have a couple other questions. How long does it take for you to draw a comics page, and how do you manage your time with busy work and family? Okay, great. So the first question. This is a bit of a cop-out answer, but it depends. Okay, so for instance, that page that I showed you that I drew, that took about 2 days of drawing and, let's call it 14 hours or so. That's unusual, and most pages do not take that long, and they can't take that long. It's just like too slow. It just depends on the focus of the page and what kind of detail I think that the page calls for. Other pages will take me half a day, and it really just depends on all the visual elements and what kind of detail is required. And the other question is, how do you manage your time with busy work and family? I don't know, maybe you should ask my wife about whether or not I'm doing a good job managing my time with work and family. What I will say is, I was just talking about this earlier. I say that I'm a comic book artist and a medical doctor, but I do not devote the same amount of time to both all the time. What happens is I will sometimes do much more medicine and less comics, and I'll sometimes do much more comics and less medicine. And it's this push-pull balance that, frankly, I'm still trying to figure out now. Sometimes I'll devote part of my week just to drawing and part of my week just to medicine. And other times it'll be all comics and no medicine, and all medicine and no comics. And so I found that to balance my two interests, it means being very flexible and being able to adapt to those two situations. His other question is, how do you plan to create a comic about Russia? I absolutely do. I don't know what it would look like. I don't know the story I would tell, but my wife and I have lived here for 3 years. We love it here. We love Russia. We love the city of Moscow. It's so compelling. It's so different, but it's also very familiar. And it's a question of how to tell the story and what sorts of things, what sort of themes I want to talk about. But I'm a journaler. I take a lot of notes about my life and like what happened and things that I'm thinking. And so I have a lot of notes about Russia. And I'm still trying to figure out what kind of story I want to tell from those notes or experiences. But it'll happen. I don't know when it'll happen. I know it's going to happen eventually. I have another question from Rainbow. If we can define the genre graphic medicine, then we can define graphic psychology and graphic any other sciences. This is a fantastic question. So I'm part of this group of people who work in the graphic medicine field, and this is a topic. Do we kind of keep redefining or subdefining the genre? Can we talk about other fields in science and medicine? The answer is yes. People can do whatever they want. There's a question about the utility of defining comics as graphic medicine or independent or, manga or things like that. There's utility in scholarship. So sometimes people, if they want to study things and they want to narrow their scope, having a title like graphic medicine helps corral a lot of information and focus your scholarship. On the other hand, it's a bit of a marketing tool, right? I mean, if I need to market my book to an audience, if I am working with a publisher and they say, okay, how are we going to get people interested, or who are we going to advertise to? Graphic medicine becomes a convenient tool to say, hey, this comic I'm working on is in the field of graphic medicine. You automatically start selecting for certain people with certain interests, probably of a certain age. And so if it is beneficial to other comics in the future to be defined or subdefined as graphic psychology or, graphic mathematics or things like that, then I think they should do it. Whether or not that's good, or if that's funneling in too narrow a fashion and excluding too many people, I don't know. I don't decide that, but it's something that's up for kind of active debate right now. Okay, I have another question. Colleague, you're a lucky man. You have time to practice your hobbies besides working in medicine. In any case, I wish you success in developing your creative. Okay, this is not a question. This is just an awesome comment. Thank you very much. Okay, great. So this is another question. Could you please recommend more comics about cancer treatment? Yes. Okay, if you are going to start with comics about cancer, the first one you need to start with is called Our Cancer Year by Harvey Pekar. That's Harvey, Harvey, Pekar, Pekar. So Harvey Pekar is this writer from Ohio who made a series of real-life comics, some of the most important comics ever made, some of the most important independent comics made, but he was diagnosed with cancer. And so he describes in really, really specific detail what it was like to get treated for cancer for a year. And then there are a bunch of other great titles too. In fact, there's almost like a whole subcategory of cancer-related comics. There's Mom's Cancer by Brian Fees. There's Relatively Indolent but Relentless. Just a bunch of other comics. What I can do is I can provide this information and we can spread it on our social media channels, but there are a lot of titles to look up. You can probably Google it. But definitely, if you're going to start and you want to see how it's done well, and you want to start with a prototypical example, start with Our Cancer Year by Harvey Pekar. A question from Andre. What do you think about movies based on comics? I think, on one hand, movies that are made about comics that popularize the genre, that get people to read comics, are always going to be a good thing, even if I don't like the movie. I think, on the other hand, a lot of movies based on comic books are unsuccessful because sometimes they're so focused on getting the look right or doing fan service or making the costumes look right that they kind of miss the point of the story. And I'll bring up the example of Watchmen. I don't know if any of you in the audience have seen it, but the movie that came out in 2009 is really not very good. It's tough to tackle a comic like Watchmen, which is so highly regarded and so complex. But what was interesting about that movie is it looked exactly how it should. All the characters' costumes were pitch perfect, but it just missed the themes of the story. It didn't talk about what it's like to have kind of a real superhero among a bunch of other superheroes who were just normal people dressed in costume. It didn't talk about the crisis of middle age. It didn't talk about any of that. It just looked exactly like the comic did, but just played it beat by beat. So I think a lot of comic book movies are unsuccessful as a standalone device if the creative team doesn't get the message of the original comic. But on the whole, I'm happy when anything promotes comics or gets people to read comics or go to comic book stores. How did your patients react when they find out you're an artist? Most of the time, they don't know. I don't walk in and be like, hey, I'm a doctor. I'm also a comic book artist. What brings you in here today? If they do find out, I think it's usually people respond very well to it. What I've found in my two fields that seem pretty disparate is that things that I learn or experience in one field greatly inform the other because they seem so far apart. So I'll make connections in art because of things I've experienced in medicine, and I'll make connections in medicine because of things I've experienced in art. And I feel very fortunate in that way. And I think patients recognize that. They know that I might have that little bit more breadth of experience because I work professionally in a completely different field. All right, final question. What advice would you give to someone who wants to create comics, or to someone who is hesitant to make a full-time job out of their hobby? Okay, I'll tackle the first question because the second question seems really, really difficult. So for someone who wants to create comics, this seems trite, but do not wait around. Don't figure out exactly the right way to start. Just start making comics. If you have a pencil or a pen and a piece of paper, or if you have a tablet, start making comics. The only way you will learn and the only way you will do it, and the only way you will get good is just by continuing to do it. And I speak as someone who made a lot of those mistakes. I had this idea in my head. I love drawing, and I've been drawing for a long time. But when I was working on some stories, I would hesitate. I would do practice. I would work out all these different ideas in my head. And frankly, that's a waste of time. You should be working through all that. You should make mistakes. You should be bad before you're good. There's this expression that everyone has 10,000 bad drawings in them. And the sooner you get those 10,000 out of you, the better an artist you'll be. And that's the idea with comics too. If you're interested in it, start doing it. Now, it does not pay a lot of money. It's not a frankly stable job. But as far as honing your skills, as far as posting online, as far as distributing, no one is really going to force you to do it. It's not like school. So you do have to start doing it on your own and being very disciplined. But you'll get better and you'll start making connections with other people. And you'll only do that after you start. And you just start without thinking about it. What advice do I give to someone who's hesitant to make a full-time job out of their hobby? I don't want to lead people to financial ruin, okay? It's romantic to say just follow your passions and everything will be fine. But that's not the reality, okay? Life is expensive. You got to pay rent. You have personal responsibilities. You might have responsibilities to a partner, to a family. What I'd say has worked for me is, as long as I feel comfortable, I try and find a balance between the idea of like financial stability versus pursuing my hobbies. So everyone has the sort of line that they won't cross. I must not be this passionate romantic artist because I'm not willing to become completely destitute for my art. I still would like to afford groceries and pay for my kids' education. So wherever you feel personally, if you have a hobby, I think you should continue doing it anyway because it's important for people to people's mental health to pursue their hobbies. But if you want to do it professionally, I say do whatever you're going to do as your stable job, your day job that can pay the bills, that can pay for life, and then slowly build up that proportion of time you spend on your hobby. And when you feel like you're able to start doing things professionally, and all that means is you're able to sell your artwork, you're able to sell a print online, then you start cutting down on that normal day job and you start expanding the hobby. So my advice, which again is very pragmatic and very unromantic, is don't just leap blindly into it. You can slowly scale up the professional aspect of your art or your hobby and see if it's viable for you financially before just throwing it all away to pursue your career. Now, I say that. I know plenty of artists who have done the opposite. They say I'm like a hack and I'm like a sellout. And if you feel passionate about your art and you're like, I can't do anything else, this is my calling, then please, more power to you. I just know that it's really tough. It's a racket. Excuse me, it's a tough racket to make money in art. And so I just don't want people to think that you just jump into it and you don't have any other practical concerns, or to provide for those practical concerns is a bad thing. I think it's perfectly reasonable, and you just got to find that balance on your own. All right, so we are a little over time, but I really want to thank everyone for these great questions. I had a lot of fun. I hope you all learned at least something moderately interesting, or even if you just took that screenshot and you just start reading some of those comics, then I will feel that I've done my job. I want to thank you for your time. I want to thank the hosts, American Center in Moscow. Again, my name is Dr. Ryan Montoya. I want you all to have a great rest of your day or great evening. I want you to join us again for the next American Center in Moscow comics event, which should be coming soon. Thank you.